I'd like to say a very warm welcome to you all. I'm conscious how busy our days are, conscious that time is short. So thank you for giving up some time to be with us. Really very excited to welcome the marvellous panel we have today. So first up, Sue, well, actually not first up, last up, but first on my screen, Sue Vincent from Urban Design Learning, no longer Urban Design London. Sue actually genuinely, I think, brings us a unique perspective on this in that she's both a qualified professional and someone who's worked for many, many years in the urban design learning field, and someone who's served as a councillor for many years, on a planning committee for 17 years. So she must have started when she was very young, and has also been a portfolio holder in an important council in London on that. And then also by my colleagues, David Milner, the Deputy Director of Create Streets, who's doing very, very important thinking at the moment on the digitisation of design codes and on the links between transport, highways infrastructure and place quality, and by my colleague Robert Kwolek, one of our senior urban design officers at Create Streets, who is working on a wide range of design codes and elements of master plans up and down the country. Largely, they're not entirely in a rural and a small town context. I should say this is being recorded and will be available subsequently on YouTube. So anything you put into the chat, do be aware that it will become public. I am going to kick off. I've got a very brief presentation just to give a little bit of context, which hopefully will come up now. This is always the moment of risk. Let's just pull that. Can I just check? Has that come up full screen? I've got completely the wrong place. I don't know why I've come halfway down the thing. Forgive me. That's gone wrong. Right, design coding for beginners. Though actually, I think hopefully it'll be useful to people who are not just beginners as well. That's what I should have been speaking to just now. Just a quick couple of comments on what Create Streets is. Hopefully we're known to most of you, but to those who don't, we're a social enterprise. We have an associated charity, the Create Streets Foundation. Do give generously if you're so minded. At our heart, we do research into the relationship between the built environment and good outcomes for humans and indeed for the planet. Where are people happy? Where do they speak to more of their neighbours? Where do they wish to be? Where will they spend more to live? Where will they lead more sustainable lifestyles? We then advocate off the back of that, both for planning reform locally and nationally, and for interventions and investments that we hope are aligned with the data and the research and what people like and where they wish to be and where they are happy. We then support statistically mainly neighbourhood groups, but we charge a little bit more to the developers or landowners we work with and also the councils. And then, as hopefully we will be doing a little bit today, we then try and help those of you in the built environment profession, or indeed those beyond it, to create better, more beautiful, more resilient and sustainable places. Here is a little bit of our research, some of our books into some of these studies. We try and make our advocacy available in pamphlet form, book form, pamphlet form, and also in videos. Here's a little one-pager on trying to pull together in ways that the wider public can sort of get their teeth into quickly, the types of places that people tend to prefer. This is an example from a master plan we were working on in Devon. I think this one was a year or so ago, as you can see, trying to weave in existing hedgerows with clear street patterns and blocks with safe backs and fronts. Here's a CGI of some new streets we're currently working on, have been working on. One of the design codes we worked on, which David will be talking about in some length, and master plans. The second thing I just wanted to talk about for a couple of minutes was some of the background to why design codes, I'm very pleased to say, are now a more prominent part of the English planning system than they were a few years ago. As some of you may recall, in January 2020, literally just a month or so before the pandemic hit, it does sort of seem a world away now, we published well, not we Create Streets, but the government published the report Living with Beauty, which is the final report of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. I think it's probably fair to say that it was a commission that was quite controversial in its inception, but I hope by the time it published became less controversial. I think that's true, and that made a series. So this is more digitized than I wanted it to be. That made a series of proposals, which you'll be delighted to go through now, but as to how the planning system might change. And one key one, or two key linked ones, was to bring some of the democracy forward so that there were clearer quality asks in the local planning, in local plans, to focus on places, not just houses, but also to learn how to bring the democracy forward and understand what communities liked and what they would support actually in the local plan making process, not just relying entirely on a case-by-case basis. As I mentioned, The good news is actually, I think our proposals were largely uncontroversial, including people, and Lee Rich is here from Cllr, who expecting to disagree with it, ended up agreeing with most of it. David Rudlin, likewise. And I hope one of the reasons for that was we pulled into the research and our report, some quite important evidence. One was that the public, and you can see that on the left of this page, public were not trusting the planning and development process to create better places. I mean, these are very low levels of trust. And that we were seeing some quite dramatic patterns in terms of price premiums for older neighbourhoods versus newer neighbourhoods, and people who would or wouldn't consider buying homes in new places. So I think it was widely accepted by those who gave us evidence that something was going wrong. Probably people blame slightly different things for that. We also brought in evidence showing how very low density living, well, it does have some advantages, are also associated with very bad outcomes, not just for community integration and personal well-being and happiness, but also with health, and of course with transport patterns. We looked at some of the research as to how greenery is good for you, and advocated, and this is now part of the NPPF, for new street trees in streets, and for clearer quality asks. I won't go through this, but just there are clear patterns, and perhaps first takeaway, which we won't go into more detail today, is there are patterns in terms of block patterns when you've got clear backs and fronts associated with lower crime, presence of street trees associated with cleaner air, more walking, more neighbourliness, facades which are more variegated, which got coherent complexity, such as the one on the left versus the one on the right, associated with people actually behaving in a more pro-social way, being more spontaneously ready to help passers-by. One-way streets, for example, being associated not just with faster speeds, but with more accidents, lower values, and less tax returns for the public sector. And then perhaps most famously, this is a project that many of you probably know that's recently been replicated in Bristol. Streets with heavy amounts of traffic being associated with fewer neighbourly friendships. The three streets you see in front of you are similar streets in a study done about 30, 40 years ago. As I say, recently replicated, the most heavily trafficked street, very clearly associated with the fewer neighbourhood friendships, something actually I recognise from my own life and where I live. The value of things such as modest front gardens, which gardens of about this size, as you see in this picture, are associated with knowing more neighbours and actually having more neighbourly relationships. Conscious time, I'm going to crack on. So the point is that design is not purely subjective, and you can see this then in some of the values and the relationships you can find between urban morphology and how much people will pay to live in certain types of places. I won't speak to this slide in detail, but this is based on a study of every single property sale in London a few years ago. So one of the consequences of that, just to cut to the chase, was recent changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, a PPG, to encourage beautiful placemaking, popular engagement, and requiring good design, not just refusing poor design, which is having a very clear and already measurable outcome on the ease with which councils can reject developments which are not well designed. That we can now see that in research that Matthew Carmona has done, and requirement for biodiversity net gain, which is also obviously coming through legislation, but is now there clearly in the NPPF. I will jump over that because I don't want to run over time, as I'm the chair. I meant to set a good example to my colleagues. It also led to the publication a couple of years ago of an excellent document, National Model Design Code, which will be very much the a leitmotif all the way through the conversation we are about to have. So I'm repeating myself there. Here we are. The NPPF has these specific asks, and many others that are relevant. Paras 127, 128, 129, and 134 are probably the most relevant for this conversation. That design policy should be developed in local communities, encouraging the use of the National Design Codes, encouraging use of codes, encouraging development and plans that reflect local aspirations and effective community engagement. And then critically, as I just mentioned, development that's not well designed should be refused. I think the most single important brief change in the NPPF. Importantly, this hasn't happened yet, but as many of you probably know, the Levelling Up and Regen Bill, still going through Parliament, also has a requirement that using the National Model Design Code, councils should have authority-wide codes in place. So this is coming, and it's going to be even more relevant and hopefully reflecting the evidence on the types of places people like and that are good for them around the country. And this is very much, if those of you who work in the public sector wish, allowing you to get on the front foot in setting what good looks like and feels like and behaves like, around in your part of England or the UK. The National Model Design Code itself is is actually really a process and a framework rather than a code in itself. I'm not going to speak to it in detail here, and Robert and David and Sue in different ways will pick it up. But I will say, I think this is that it's structured into these 10 sections, some of which I think are perhaps more important than others, some of which I think you can have longer debates about than others. But that in thinking now about codes, writing them, perhaps the second key takeaway, if the first is that design is not purely subjective, I think a second key takeaway is that you do need to know this and think about which bits of these you want to code for or not code for. You don't necessarily, in fact, you certainly don't. You probably normally do not need to code for most of them, or all of them, I should say. If they're not things that are decided to be locally important, you might decide this is not an area you're going to make a huge focus on, but there will be some that are particularly important. I have set a bad example and gone a minute over, so I will stop there, but that's the background to the conversation we're having. And I will now hand over to Robert, who's going to talk about coding in a rural and a small town context. Robert, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Please let me know if my slides are up.
They are, yes.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, as Nicholas said, today I'm going to be talking about a couple of the design codes, both that I've been working on and that colleagues have been working on. Wychavon, which is a largely rural district council in Worcestershire. And then in Chesham, we've been working on infill design code and neighborhood development order. So Wychavon, this is a project that we started working on last year. We were brought in by Wychavon because they asked us to review, firstly, their design strategy. And then we had a workshop with local officials, councillors, and that piece of work led to a design code. And it's even though it's largely rural, there are 3 towns as well, which some of you might know: Pershore, Evesham, and Droitwich Spa. Also 96 hamlets and villages and a population of about 132,000 people. So it's quite a diverse area, which we'll get into a bit later with area types. It kind of went without saying at this point, when we got involved last year, the National Model Design Code had been published, I think about a year earlier. The Pathfinder program was starting out. So we knew that we'd be working with the National Model Design Code structure in place. And as Nicholas said, some of the structure will be more relevant to some areas than others. So on the right is the table of contents that we arrived at working with Wychavon's officials. We didn't, for example, include counterterrorism and things like that are certainly not applicable to this area. And we shuffled the structure around a little bit. It was very important, for example, for officials to focus on nature and transport and movement. So we moved some of those earlier on into the document, and then had buildings at the very end, almost kind of looking at it at various scales, which I'll get into a bit later as well. So those of you who know the area might know that it's quite a diverse area in terms of its character. The south of Wychavon is actually the very northern edge of the Cotswolds. And then you also have towns which have a mix of large Georgian and Victorian neighborhoods, suburbs on their edges, and then a wide diversity of architectural and vernacular styles as well, from Cotswold stone in the south to Elias stone in the east, a lot of timber frame, a lot of brick. So we had to decide how exactly we tackle this issue of character area. So we decided to split it up into 4. Cotswold's Edge at the very south would be its own area, Pershore and the surrounding region its own, and then Evesham and the Vale of Evesham and Droitwich Spa in the north would all be kind of their own character areas, which we'd code for separately. That doesn't mean that we'd kind of start from scratch every time, but we wanted the documents to be easy to pick up for a developer, an architect, any designer, or even a resident, and have it focused just on the area where they happen to live in or where they might be designing in. And area types are quite a big part of the National Model Design Code, which sets out a number of different area types that you could use. So again, we had a session with Wychavon's team, a number of sessions and follow-up meetings to decide just which area types would be most applicable to Wychavon. So we landed first on a series of 7 that you'd find throughout Wychavon, and then in some of the areas you'd only use a few of them. So for example, the Cotswolds is very rural, So there we only ended up needing to use villages, rural, and local centers. And as I said, we approached it at 3 different scales. So almost you have the area-wide scale, which is all of Wychhaven, which you could kind of just reuse a lot of the same principles, things like use, nature, movement principles do not differ that dramatically between them. And then within the individual geographic areas, you start getting into character that changes. So shop fronts are different materials, different house types, different types, perhaps different parking strategies. And then at the area type scale, which is the division of individual settlements, then you get into where things really get very, very different. So different boundary treatments, different approach to blocks and density. And how we coded was something that we've started doing with a lot of the codes we're doing, which is 3 levels of guidance: your musts, shoulds, and your cans. The musts are the mandatory things. They're ones that you absolutely have to do, no exceptions. The shoulds are strongly encouraged, and where you can't apply a should, you would have to justify it on a case-by-case basis, with everything needing to be approved. And then the cans, are just things that are recommended, the nice to haves, which you don't necessarily have to include. And we really want to stress that without must, a code is not a code, but merely guidance, or really much the same as we have now. So if you're not going to be including the must, the things that you have to do, then it's really not a design code. So so that's something to bear in mind. And a couple of examples here of how the code looks like. So as I said, we made codes for parking, for street types, for block patterns. And we found that the pattern book approach is really quite effective to visualize the codes that we'd be setting out. So you have your text-based codes, but then it's very important to show, what exactly those codes are. It's easy to interpret text in any kind of way you want, but if you show it visually, then it's much more difficult for someone to kind of, have their own interpretation. And we also applied the pattern book approach to house types. So we designed separate house types for each geographic area. So here on the screen, you see some house types for the Cotswolds Edge. And the way the house types would be used is you could use them to get fast track for planning permission, but it doesn't mean that these are the only house types you can build in any area. Here you can see house types for each of the other areas. And the idea is that you could mix various features of what go into houses, always kind of keeping in mind the local context. And the code is quite strong in some areas about what buildings should look like in terms of materials. But then you can switch out windows, say sash windows, casement windows, different materials for different areas, or even different details and ornament for various areas. Now I'm quickly go over Chesham NDO, conscious of time. So the neighborhood development order is actually quite new, and this is going to be the first one in the country to embed hundreds of homes on infill sites, and being very clear this time about house types. So what's an NDO? An NDO was introduced 2011 Localism Act alongside neighborhood plans. It's the bottom tier of local government to permit development. So Chesham was facing a lot of development pressure, and local residents had rejected sort of development on greenfield land and development in the AONB. So Create Streets was asked to come in and see how we could de-risk planning in the area in a way that's organic, that locates homes in the town center and brings life back into the town center, and do it in a way that improves the town and respects its character. And it also moved the democracy forward. A lot of times with development, people don't really have their say until the very end of the process, but we felt that it's very important that people had their say throughout. So we tried 2 approaches: engaging wide and engaging deep, using our Create Communities tool, which we very often use with pretty much all the design codes we've been working on, which is our online platform. And then we took that one step further by in-person events, workshops of the local community and parks, and at the Christmas fair, to kind of boil down exactly which aspects of the house designs they liked. 4 NDO clusters, 18 sites in total on a variety of infill sites. Here's kind of the approach we've been using with site design, starting with street design, kind of zooming into blocks and then individual plots. And the approach we've been using is by coding which house types you could use for individual plots, and then quite strict codes about what you could do on those. Here's a family of house types. We designed 20 in total for the various plot sizes and various sites that we have. And then also some that respect the local heritage for larger buildings, for blocks of flats, which are quite similar to a lot of the warehouse buildings that Cheshire has historically had. So quick 10 top tips for me, things that I've learned working on design code. So I think it's always really important to ask and refer back to what are you actually trying to accomplish. It's not just an empty exercise, but there should be a very kind of clear goal in mind. Code should be easily understood by lay people and professionals alike. They should set clear requirements to which designs can clearly conform or not. Code should be visually led with plenty of photos and diagrams. As I said, it's easy to interpret text, but photos and diagrams are much more difficult. The more must, the stronger of a design code. Without must and shoulds, a code is not a code. Avoid language like where appropriate. Where appropriate means very, very different things to different people. So, the job of the code is to tell you what is and isn't appropriate. So don't use empty language like that. And use community engagement to gauge residents' most valued elements. And you should see yourself as working ultimately for residents, not necessarily officials, developers, or architects. And I realize there will be tensions there, and there certainly have been tensions on projects I've worked on. But ultimately, it's the residents who will be living with the consequences of the design code.
I have to hurry you along, Robert. Okay. You only got a few seconds left. Just quickly rattle through the rest.
Identify what you don't want, close the loopholes. Code should be strongest in areas most important to local residents, and that will come out of the engagement work. And ideally, you should see yourself as defending what makes a place for place. Otherwise, what's the point of the code?
Marvelous. Robert, thank you very, very much. That was brilliant. Absolutely marvelous. And not just because you work with me. David just gone off screen for me. Hopefully that's only for me. David, are you still there? Yes, you are. You've come back. Can I just encourage everyone to start putting questions into the chat? We've had one already from Chris Evans, a very good one. We'll come back to that. Thank you, Chris. David, over to you. David's going to talk to us about the Surrey street design guide, turning it into code, and then the digitizations of codes. David, over to you. I can't see David's screens. Can anyone else not see? No, none of us can see your screens.
I can't see it either.
We might go back to, I think, while David sorts that out, David, if you can stop doing that, and we'll just perhaps go to Sue's presentation. We'll just flip the order. Sorry about that. Is that okay, Sue? Are you able to follow on? But David's having a technical snafu. Just
can you see it now?
No, we still can't see it. Oh no, you've come up. You've come up. Right, we'll crack on. There you go. False alarm, Sue. You okay, David? You're on.
Yeah, just had to run my laptop and keep it nice and calm. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Robert. Robert set the scene very nicely on what's in a design code. So I want to kind of give you a glance through a slightly different design code, which is looking at Surrey's street design. So this is very much focusing on highways and streets and what we might call the horizontal infrastructure. So firstly, okay, what were the outcomes for Surrey street design? We were tasked with raising the bar for new and existing streets. So this would look.
Can I just check? Sorry, David. Forgive me for interrupting you. I'm sort of just about making you out, but only just. I just want to check that. Robert, for example, can you hear David?
It sounds quite robotic.
Yeah, I think really? It's not quite working. Can you just lean forward and see if that works a bit better? I think you're right. Try again.
Is this better at all?
Yes, that is a bit better.
Okay. Right, I'll hopefully try not to sound so robotic. So the two outcomes were raising the bar for new and existing streets, and then clarity and transparency for residents. And this is very much, as I said, focused on highways as well. Places that aren't just roads to move through, but also prosperity and sustainability. So broaden the focus to include health, happiness, prosperity, and sustainability, which is moving thinking about the KPIs of highways officials towards achieving healthy places and not just hitting traffic numbers. Nicholas set out the broader context, but we've also got Money for Streets. We've had gear change, which has come in as national policy, and Surrey was aiming to lead the way by codifying what is a healthy street. So in a nutshell, 3 principles. It's clear. We wanted to give developers clarity, we wanted to give planners clarity, more visual, and removing that vague language that Robert's been talking about. To make it usable, when we were designing this and building this code from the outset, we knew that it might end up on a website one day. So we were almost thinking of this in terms of an Excel spreadsheet, if you like, or a database. How could each line of code, almost as computer code is, be written to stand alone and be understandable by people and eventually machines potentially. And for it to be very bold as well. They wanted to lead the way, and that was great to have the backing to sort of drive forward where others are not going. And I think probably the most important thing on this slide actually is the bottom paragraph on the right. The design is built into the viability. So by having the code and by saying you must do this, you must do this, you must do this, you're then effectively taking any of that extra value out of the land price, because if there's 10 developers looking to buy this land, they all know that they're going to have it. It covered pretty much everything. We had a tricky overlap between principles, which you'd often find in a design guide, but also getting into technical detailing. How do you build root protection systems for tree pits? What kind of materials can you use on shared services? So there's, and you can't go too far down the line, or your code is going to become 450 pages long. So we wanted to go sort of as far as you could, such that anyone who was making master planning or big sort of early REBA 2, for example, vision decisions, knew enough about what might end up there eventually. There were 6 principles. I won't read all these out because I'm conscious we want to sort of canter through, but you can see, we tested the code back to these principles midway through the code, through writing the code at the end, to really see, is our code helping to create streets that are beautiful? Is our code helping to create green streets that enrich biodiversity, enhance the environment, improve air quality? And if it wasn't, we would go back and try and rewrite the code. And also actually was very helpful to have these principles such that when you had trade-offs, which is the point of urban design, when you had trade-offs between different competing ideas or competing outcomes, you could go back to these principles and settle those. One of which has been very helpful, is the inverted, if you like, pyramid. So the clear hierarchy of users that puts pedestrians, people who are rolling and wheeling at the top, cyclists below, public transport, commercial vehicles, and then private vehicles, which play a role in plenty of the streets, but there's very subtle changes which can help those up the top and that need it most. So some of the things in the code, as I say, cantering through, this I think is quite a powerful diagram. It is looking at tackling DMRB. So for those that don't know, the design manual for roads and bridges, which might be the bane of many people's lives. Maybe there's 1 or 2 people who enjoy using it, and that's because it is it is an easy thing to use. But unfortunately, what's happened is it started to sort of damage our town centres, our high streets, by really sort of the highwayification of some of the market towns across the UK, actually. So what we've set is that new developments that will be creating any urban environment or any village environment where people would be likely to be walking or cycling, or your kid will be out playing, do not use DMRB, and they use healthy streets and Surrey, and then anything that's not covered there, be using manual for streets with the updated version coming out, hopefully, fingers crossed, soon. We looked really big picture. I think this is important. We started very big, looking at connectivity, how the urban design, thinking about what are the first few steps when someone is designing a new development, whether it's 50, 20 or 10,000 homes. And obviously one of those is on connectivity. Also integrating into transport. There's no point creating a lovely walkable place where we have parking standards that are slightly more ambitious if we're not providing the public transport. So it's important we integrated this with Surrey's LTP4, which was running along and just slightly ahead, which was actually quite a nice process to fill in. But then actually we do drive down to the small and the detail. And I almost sort of think of this and our design in general actually creates, which is a bit of a sort of
David, can I just encourage you to keep leaning forward if that's okay, just to improve audio, thank you.
Yeah, so I think of this as a way to almost operate like a pincer movement, so that you've got the big picture boundaries of what you're setting you can and can't do, and then at the bottom that the individual materials, the detail, the street corners, the street trees, the greenery is set as well, and that gives developers then that very tight playground to work with, such that they're meeting the needs of residents. A few examples now of some of the codes themselves. So this is looking at some of the primary streets, and you can see for the eagle-eyed, you can see some of the continuous footways. We've got some of the level surfaces. We've got segregated bike lanes, plenty of street trees. So really trying to bring in the MPPF asks on street trees, really trying to bring in things like LTM 120 and engage change into the street design that you can see. And then we're coding obviously at the plan view, which is very important, but as well at the section view, So you can't really code one or the other in our view. You do need to have that plan view top down. How does the street change along its length versus the section, and how wide is the street, and how is it enclosed, crucially, to create that into place within the enclosure golden rules that we all know about, trying to sort of strive for your one-to-one height to width where possible. I think this is quite a nice diagram. You almost encapsulates, the whole code really in its purpose, and saying, do not do what is on the left, do what is on the right. And this is bringing in actually the biodiversity increase, the walkability increase, still permitting vehicle flow where it is, and also being flexible with on-street parking as well. And it's quite clear now that sort of any new developments within Surrey, I think this would be one of the most visible tests as to are they or are they not combining the code. And that extends further. We've got very clear visual guidance again on where you've got any junctions. And then also the opportunities, as I said, it's not just about new places. We're trying to use the code as it's now being used in Reigate for retrofit as well. And any opportunity to sort of gain back a little bit of placemaking, which could be in the form of a bit of greening up, bit of widening some curves, bit of tightening some radii, and there's some good examples as well. And our approach as well, I'm not sure if we might be the only codes to have a sort of an EV code embedded within highways. I'm sure there'll be lots catching up as well, but we took a policy that you fit technology around the street and around people. You don't put the technology in, i.e. some whacking great charges, and then build the street around that. So I think acknowledging that in 5 years, probably charging infrastructure will look very, very different. And there's no point sort of building in something for 200 years for it to become redundant. And again, as I said, thinking quite big on public transport and how does our street work with public transport. So moving on to the digital phase now.
And David, I'm going to have to hurry you along. So just in a minute or so, please, not more for this. Thank you.
Okay. So with the digital phase, the mantra is database, not documents. So we've got what's interesting about the Surrey design code is it's not a sort of traditional HTML website. And I'm going to try and be ambitious here. And hopefully, my screen will be playing a little movie which is taking you through how space.
David, that might be. Yeah, that is moving through. Yeah, that's working.
Yeah, okay, good. So hopefully that's moving through. But the idea here is all of this is not just conventional. David,
it's sorry to interrupt. With that moving, you're not audible anymore, I think. So perhaps just let it go through and then talk afterwards, I think.
I've skipped on. So hopefully you can hear me now. There's still a few freeze frames in case it wouldn't work. But the idea is all of this is drawing from a database. So instead of it being just an updated website, this is being drawn from essentially an Excel database which is sitting live, where you can filter out for the master strips and Cllrs. And any time in the next 5, 10, 20 years when Surrey changes policy or they change material potentially, they just need to update one line in their database and that will update the website automatically. And there's a real ambition that in the future this could then start talking to national databases. So if you're looking at a site in Guildford, you might have a local code which is sitting online, you might have Surrey's, and you also might have a national code as well dealing with buildings where this is dealing with highways. And then I'll pause here, but in the future, do we start looking at configurators in sort of similar way as a magnet? When you're picking your kitchen online, and you sort of set your parameter and you set how big your kitchen is, and start to think about what might fit there. Maybe we do the same with junctions, but that's just a thought. I'm going to stop sharing.
David, thank you very much indeed, and I apologise, Dave, for interrupting you for audible reasons, and sorry to everyone for the slightly non-ideal quality of the sound there. I hope you got most of that, if not all of it. I think I just about got all of it, but rich content and a very, very hopeful and powerful direction I think that is going in, which I'm very confident will set the tone for many codes in months and years to come. Right, last and certainly not least, Sue, who's got some slides, but I think so I'd also encourage you, if you wish to respond any way you wish to what you've just been seeing. We're running a few minutes behind, but nothing too dramatic. And thank you. I can see there are lots of good and rich questions coming in, so we're going to come to those soon. Sue, over to you. I think Robert has got your slides, I think.
He has. Thank you very much, Robert, for doing that, and greetings from Belgium. And delighted to see you all online. I've gone through the attendance register. I'm not quite sure there's a lot of beginners out there, actually, Nicholas. There's some very experienced people's names that I recognise. So delighted.
Well, it's said for beginners, so they can't complain.
Well, it's always good to underline your knowledge. So just a very quick advert, Urban Design Learning. We undertake shared training events with the public sector, and we really encourage people to learn not only from the speakers we have, but from each other, ensuring that we share that knowledge and expertise between us and public sector to enable better placemaking. So from the front line, I'll start off to say, so I'm going to just run through what we've picked up over the last year from undertaking training with about 75 authorities outside London. And they've had an interest in finding out more about codes, what it means for them, and what sort of issues they've raised and what's needed to support them. So, of course, first of all, why code? Next slide, please. I remember that. Next slide, please. So we code LPSA because we're told to. We're told to, and we are now, it's a new, for many local authority officers, this is a new skill, a new approach to dealing with placemaking. And one of the things that particularly came out, I think, was the working with different silos within their own authority. So planners working with highways, so encouraging highways to prioritise place. And I think the Create Streets Surrey guide is an excellent example of that, of ensuring planners work together and they work with highways to ensure place quality is really uppermost in their mind. Obviously, people want to try and dilute opposition to development, but turning that on its head, I think it's really important to bring people with you. And as Nicholas said earlier, about bringing democracy forward and that engaging of wide and deep, really important. And people do understand that in local authorities. And I think also just to create more interesting work, to be proactive rather than the constant reactive. Next slide, please. So the lessons, what were the issues? What we learned was that a lot of local authorities well, what are design codes and why aren't the design guides good enough? So where to start, how to prioritise their work. And through conversations, it was particularly with their DM officers for those sorts of knotty issues that come up time and time again, for parking, for example, where to prioritise the issues that are most concerned to local authorities. The other thing I think that really came up was, working in partnership with others. We've got to learn something new and then translate this to ensure others can understand what we're aiming to do to create better places. So a lot interested, slightly sceptical, how's this going to work? But of course, issues number one for local authorities in public sector with resources dwindled is obviously recruitment, retention, and people in-house with the right skills. And those skills include engagement, as we've said, digital skills most certainly, and technical skills. But it's also urban design skills, landscape skills, sustainability skills, those things that have come along, net carbon. Those things are quite new as well, new policies and new approaches to understand. Next slide, please. So what are local authorities asking for? And I think clarity, what are codes, what are guides, and Robert went through that very helpfully, but also guidance on giving best practice examples, to be able to show people what it actually is and what will be achieved from it. So, and particularly, I think, having others available to help as critical friends to give advice and guidance on the process of doing design code training. Again, guidance with engaging with communities is a very different approach. Doing it up front, doing it beforehand, getting agreement and getting consensus with your local communities is really important. And I saw a question, I'm sure we'll come to that later, about how do you do good engagement. Next slide, please. One of the things as well that came up actually, just to sort of put one side, is some authorities were concerned that it could turn into doing design by Argos catalogue, as one very senior and experienced planner said to me. But I think once people began to understand the direction and the approach and the reason why the rules would exist, to the musts and the shoulds, I think that it can provide a very clear and consistent design approach that everybody understands and can make the process a lot simpler. One of the issues we talked about, we've already talked about the sort of parking, but also the stages of coding and how you go through each coding stage, to be able to explain that to other people, and without, with councillors, to explain to their members, to ensure that people are taken along. And using images is really important, to be able to see clear, consistent images, so that people have examples, as both Robert and David were showing us earlier. Next slide, please. Devil's always in the detail, which I love that, and I think that the important thing for local authorities was, first of all, was the sort of confusion: how on earth do you code for a whole area when they're so diverse, with different characters, and how to tie codes now within the plan making process. And I think this is becoming much clearer as we move further on and we get the Cllr, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, finally in print. And engagement came through very strongly. Tall buildings, how can we code for tall buildings? What are the sorts of things we need? And people do want the precedents. They want to see examples, in codes in Greenbelt, codes in rural areas, but also to ensure that those the detail is shared from the pathfinders. And I know we're excitedly waiting for the pathfinders to be published, and the results from the pathfinders will be coming out very soon, and how people did it, what they cost. And I think that, as a lot of people feel, good design is not rocket science, and design codes are a good tool to ensure that we can get good design for our local communities. It is important to have local authorities properly resourced, without a doubt, and to ensure those skills are in-house. I'm really pleased that Urban Design Learning are part of this, and have been part of understanding codes and training on codes for some time, to ensure that our local authorities make better informed choices, and also to ensure that planning is for public benefit. So thank you very much, and I look forward to some questions.
Marvellous. Thank you very much indeed, Sue. And I will encourage questions. We've got another very long one has just come in. So look, I think we actually have some really rich questions in the chat. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all speakers. We've got another 16 minutes, so we'll crack through them. I think there are 4 themes in the questions so far. There are some questions on the overall, if you like, the process, to some degree, the sort of philosophy of design codes, questions on the time frame, how you do engagement, how you achieve beauty. There's one about how you make sure the public aren't too reactionary. I'll come back to that. Then there are some specific questions on the Whiteshaven Code, and there's some specific questions on the streets section that was implicit in Surrey. Interesting, not many on digital. And then I think there's some questions that are more wide-ranging about sort of social spaces, or a real killer question, which I'm going to flag up now, but I'm not going to ask people to answer at this stage, which is the 5 towns that are getting it all right, or getting most of it right, which I think is jolly hard. So I'm just telling everyone that's coming, but I'm not going to force you to answer that now. What we might just start with is the procedural ones. And I'll turn to Sue first, just because she's just been talking, and then to Robert, and then Robert. And I'm afraid, David, I'm going to come to you less, because your voice is definitely less nice today than everyone else's. So Sue, just in terms of engagement, how you win the engagement battle, and any feedback you had on timeframes, any thoughts on that, and then I'll turn to Robert for the same question.
I think with community engagement, I think the question was very well phrased about having people, the sort of familiar faces that come up time and time again. often I find those familiar faces are very well organised local groups with lots of people that are qualified and perhaps retired, that have time on their hands, and they really do help contribute to the local conversation. However, it's really important to go to people, where people are perhaps community centres, perhaps events that are going on over the summer. Children, younger people, what do they want? What are they looking for in their area? So I do think it's important, as you say, you said earlier, wide and deep. Not just those. I do think that local community organisations and amenity groups are really important because of their historic knowledge, but it's also important to get younger people and older people, all people, to contribute to that. And local authorities have to go out, which is why they do need the resources to make design codes a success.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sue. Robert, I think perhaps if you could just perhaps focus on some of the work we've done or that you've got experience of using the Create Communities platform and how we use that I think very much as an and function to Sue's answer, not an or, how we use that to get to hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of people to crowdsource many responses to some slightly simpler questions.
Well, I think the way we use Create Communities has somewhat shifted in the past few years, especially as we're using it to be more focused with design codes, because it started out very much as a way to get very quick feedback about really anything that people might want to change in the public realm or with larger housing developments. For example, the one we did in Litchfield had thousands of responses. With design codes, we tend to be a bit more focused. So the approach that I took with Witchaven, and which my colleague Tom took in Chesham, was we allowed people, and we certainly encourage people to still make comments about really anything they'd like, whether it's select a building or a public space that they would like to comment on, positive and negative comments. But then we also chose a selection of fixed points. So we pre-selected buildings, often in Witchaven, I would choose anywhere between, say, 12 and 20 per geographic area. I think Tom chose something like 20 in Chesham. And these would be over a wide span of building types, from 17th century cottages up until the newest builds and everything in between, to get comments on a diverse type of buildings. And it was choosing fixed points does make it much easier to compare comments about a very specific thing, and to see just how appropriate people find a particular building for a particular area, or indeed inappropriate. So yeah, I think it's sort of that mix, still allowing people to comment on anything, but also selecting particular
buildings.
You.
And I think it's really worth stressing, I think the Create Communities head of wellbeing, who's got 4 legs, is coming to give me a little lick. Here, go away, Harry, now's not the time. It's really worth stressing that, there are, obviously other ones are available, but the online platforms do now let you to get to far more people, far more cheaply, cost efficiently than even a few years ago. Also, questions quick about time frames, which again I'll give to Robert. How long is the Witchaven process taken so far? What are we building in at the moment?
Well, today it's the 23rd of June, and the very first workshop we had with the Witchaven team was the 24th of June, 2022. So
good, well done. That's very nicely turned.
We're exactly a year, and it's not quite done. The drafts of most of the geographic areas are more or less complete, and there will now be a process of feedback, and later this year they'll be going out for public consultation. So I think probably an 18-month time frame in total, assuming everything goes smoothly.
My hope would be that over time that will get quicker as we and others get more experienced and there become more patterns that you can copy. And I should have said that on the Office Place website, there's an emerging library of design codes and pattern books. It's got a dozen or so on now, and that will go up with time. Just a question on beauty, which I'm going to take quickly, because I think I'm probably the person who that's aimed at. So there's a question, quite rightly pointed, I think perfectly reasonably, saying how on earth do you get people to agree on a vague concept such as beauty? And I think the answer to that is the reason that I and others have argued for the use of the word beauty in the planning system is to help, and it will take a generation, if not longer, to rebuild the public's confidence in the quality and livability of places we create. Because I can tell you as a definitive fact, I don't think this is arguable, that the public have lost trust in the quality of places we create. And if we, those of us who are working in the design and development industry, if we are not aspiring to create places that move the heart and are good for the body, then I can assure we're not even trying, it ain't going to happen. The point about the design coding process, indeed about the planning process and design and development process, is then locally to discover what it is that people like and where they feel at home. So I don't think you need to get into a philosophical argument about whether this street is beautiful or that brick is beautiful. Just ask, what do you like? What fits in around here? How would you like to see, what type of development would you like to de-risk, making it easier to say yes to that and perhaps a bit harder to say yes to something else. So that I think is my attempt to answer that. I won't share that with the panel just because I think that one was aimed at me. Let me turn to David, hoping that his audible now. You'll have seen, David, there are a couple of specific, very good questions on specifically on streets, waste collection, how design codes take account of waste collection, recycling, wheelie bins, it's territory you know well. And another question I'll ask you, if I may, which is just on on maintenance, servicing emergency vehicles and adoption. And it's just worth stressing, obviously Surrey is the Highways Authority who we were working for. David, fingers crossed that we can hear you.
I think you should be able to. I did a sort of a cheeky restart, but my laptop's feeling a bit better now. So the bin lorry question and waste is always basically what you end up doing, isn't it, with highways design. I mean, it's, like you said, it's worth noting it was the Highways Authority. So where you've got issues around parking quantums in particular, we were seeking, we know that the districts and boroughs are going to have slightly nuanced and different views on parking, but also waste as well. So we started this, as we would, which is what will make for the best street. And then you work out, okay, if you need to have a high quantum of parking or, annoying sort of requirements on like a large waste collection bin, because that's just what large waste bin or a large lorry or recycling lorry, you need to almost have like a good, better, best approach. So think of it like a flow chart where, okay, if it's what's the best case scenario, and then design for that. And then if it's going to have a larger vehicle, can you allow it to brake tracking, which is quite an important and probably not too detailed to actually go into, but can you allow it to sort of track actually onto both lanes of the carriageway, which means that it then doesn't, you don't get these huge bell mouth sweeping junctions, which you sort of see dominate lots of the sort of estates of the past. So I think that's one. To sort of bring EV charging into it, again, we gave a sort of table, which is do this. If you can't do this, then do that. If you can't do that, then do this. So in every situation, it gives the chance to try and do the right thing, try and do the best thing you can. But some places, they will have some legacy equipment, or they'll have some legacy rules, which means they need to put in maybe some large kind of chargers. And then when that gets updated, potentially in 5-10 years' time, they can move to the next level up. So you almost go to your silver and then almost go to your gold. So hopefully that sort of gives an idea. And again, the same as with parking, which is we can't in the highways code say how much to have, but we can say, okay, here's the best way to deal with high levels of parking. And in particular in Surrey, we're looking now at peripheral parking, which is basically maybe 20 seconds or 15 seconds walk. You could have your second or third car, and then you can use on street unallocated where possible, because it makes it about 30% more efficient parking to sort of make a street very, very flexible over time. And this is the question we'd always ask is, okay, in 100 years, is this still going to work for the person? Because who knows where parking and tech is going to be there.
Thank you. I think it's a good rule of thumb, which is designed for the people, not for the tech, because the tech we can guarantee will change. Though weirdly, the behaviour is often far more continuous. One of my favourite facts is that traffic speeds in London have basically been the same for about 150 years. Tech's made absolutely no difference. You basically go in the average of central London about 8 miles an hour, however you do it.
Gosh, that fast.
Well, yes, well, that's with me. That's with me added in. So I'm going to ask a quick question. First, quickly to see, we've got 6 minutes. So I'd like you to up the tempo.
Yes, very quickly.
Feel under it. So developers buy-in, and then I'm going to come to Robert on a similar question. Developers buying in, yes, no, cynical? I don't know if you've had any wider feedback on that.
Not a huge amount of feedback, but I think there are developers that are keen and interested to try to ensure more faster and consistent approach, and of course speed. Most important for developers is speed.
And thank you, Sue. And Robert, you have, I know, because I even listened to one of them, you have had conversations as developers active in South Worcestershire. How did those conversations go?
That's right. Well, we held a developers forum with developers active in the Wychavon area, but we've also shared, and I should say, the code still is in draft form. So we shared it with one developer who is a regional developer in the area. And it's been mixed. I mean, obviously, some things developers were very happy to kind of oblige, and some of the comments I was actually pleasantly surprised at. Things I thought that they'd be quite opposed to, they weren't. Other things, some of the architectural detail, for example, or street design, perhaps were met with a bit more resistance. But I think it is worth noting that if developers are not pushing back a little to design code, then you're probably not pushing enough. I mean, the whole point of design codes is to change the way that we do development and to raise the bar for quality. So yeah, it's obvious you'll get pushback.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, otherwise why we're here. Right, another question for you, if I may quickly, Robert, on Wychavon from Paul Cllr. I note the present house designs within the code, but how flexible are the codes for good quality contemporary modern building designs that could complement the existing context?
So the code is very strong on things like materials. It's very strong about built form. It's less strong about every single architectural detail. So actually, among the house types, I've designed or I've shown examples of contemporary house types as well that would also comply with the code. I mean, ultimately, this will be up to the engagement. Just what sort of houses, what sort of architecture do local people want? You'll probably find in some areas like the Cotswolds, it is a very particular area. It has very strong character, and residents there will probably be less in favor of contemporary designs. In other areas, residents will probably be more open to contemporary designs, which is certainly what we found in Wychavon. So, design code should essentially, as far as possible, reflect local residents' desires, not necessarily being too prescriptive about every single architectural detail.
This came up quite a lot. Yes, this came up quite a lot in the training. How flexible can they be? And I think once you sort of set a design guide, design codes, if the flexibility within is if developers come in, designers, with something better, something that's perhaps over a period of time would improve the area more or have a different approach. But it certainly sets the bar, and this is what we're here for, is to improve the design of our places. And unless we do that, we're never going to reach high enough. So yes, there can be changes, there can be flexibility, but they have to get that high first and then jump higher.
I think that's very well put, and that this is the easy way to do it. So it's like, so the easy, there'll be lots of developers who'll do the easy thing, and that's nothing wrong with that. So make the easy popular and good enough, and then if there are people who want to go better and can move the yardstick, then that's great too. A very specific question on Wychavon, which will be not of huge interest, but I'll ask it anyway because I think the answer is very quick. I think I'm right in saying that the design code you're working on, Robert, doesn't include the Worcestershire Parkway, does it? I think that's correct.
Well, the idea is that it would
quickly. There's only one person interested.
It would encompass Parkway, but Parkway will have its own site-specific design code, which will get into far more detail than Wychavon's.
Yeah, and which we're not doing. Another designer is working on that, so it's not in the conversation. Right. Okay. So the killer question is coming. Those 5 towns that are doing it right. I'm sorry we've not quite managed to answer all your questions. We've done the very best we can. Who wants to go first on this very unfair question? Has anyone got anyone? David, you're a bright young man. What are your thoughts? You don't have to name 5. Just name one.
Should I give one or two?
Just give one. We'll see if we can get to 5 between us.
I mean, it's probably hard to sort of talk about too many where you're not working. So I think one which is quite exciting at the moment is Lichfield, which is actually a city, so not a town. But I go with Lichfield, looking at both an area-based design code and also some big site-specific design codes, and probably towns where there maybe is a very coherent material type tend to be quite strong on design codes because they've sort of had that ingrained for the past 50 years anyway, that this is a sort of material, and then that's obviously leads to certain types of architecture anyway because of sort of geometry and maths and physics.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a minute. Sue, anyone? You just name one, and see if we can get to 4 or 5 between us. Any town or area you'd highlight?
For design codes.
No, areas that are just doing good design and are
London Borough of Camden.
London Borough of Camden, of course. Brilliant answer.
Of course.
And what's best about the London Borough of Camden, Sue, other than Councillor Sue Vincent, who's obviously an absolute paragon in such matters?
Look, we have many good designers, and I think that there are too many to name at the moment. I'm not going to highlight any, but I do think, you know, it's such an important part of creating places that, you know, the better design we can get everywhere. But, you know, lots of authorities are doing really good, exciting stuff. So
okay, that's the end of that. That's the end of that. That's the end of that. Robert, your one sentence answer.
Well, I haven't seen details yet, but I think Cornwall is doing quite good work on design guides, which hopefully will turn into design code at some point.
And I would add my tuppenny piece. Actually, the design codes and previously guides they've had in the Cotswolds for many years, I think, have been very influential. Indeed, I was influenced by them in some of the writing I did a few years ago. Right, it's 2 o'clock. That's it. You have to go back to work now. Enough lunch break. I'd like to say a special thank you to Sue, who's broken our holiday to join us today. Thank you to Robert and David. Thank you, David, for fixing your tech. That was marvelous. High wire out there. A little bit nerve-wracking. Thank you all for paying attention. There was a question about whether the slides were available. We won't be making slides available, but the recording will be. So come to the Create Streets YouTube account. And if you'd like to work with us on design codes, or if we can help in any way, then do please get in touch. So when you get to it in a few hours' time, have a lovely weekend. Thank you. Over and out from Mission Control Create Streets. Cheerio. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.
And thank you to
everyone.
Carl
Thank you.
Sossin,
Bye,
who made the tech work. Bye-bye.